Jay McTighe brings a wealth of experience developed during a rich and varied career in education. Well known for his work with thinking skills, Jay has coordinated statewide efforts to develop instructional strategies, curriculum models, and assessment procedures for improving the quality of student thinking. He is an accomplished author, having co-authored 18 books, including the award-winning and best-selling Understanding by Design. This series was co-authored with Grant Wiggins. He also has written more than 50 articles and book chapters and been published in leading journals, including Educational Leadership, ASD, and EdWeek. I would like to warmly welcome Jay McTighe to our specialist series. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lee. Good to be with you.
Whenever we do our series, we always start with a backstory. So we like to know a little bit about where you've come from. So I've heard you say, I'm really a coach when I'm a teacher. I'm coaching kids towards the performances that we're after, whether it be in writing, reading, or problem solving. Can you tell us how your experience as a coach has shaped you as an educator and what led you to education?
Well, it's a good opportunity for me to go back into my history. I was a swimming coach early in my college and early adult life, and some of the things I learned in coaching really over time transferred quite literally into my academic teaching and my understanding of the profession. So here are a couple of lessons learned from coaching that I think really do apply to teaching. The first is that coaches are always clear why they're coaching and what they're coaching for. And in team sports in particular, they're coaching for the game. And if you think about it, the game is an authentic performance. Every game is different, and the players have to apply everything they've worked on in practice in the game, but they have to adapt their skills and their teamwork and so on to each game. So that's one of the big lessons learned for me, that being clear about your goals and more specifically about what you want students to be able to do with their learning is like how coaches think. It's always about performance. So rather than thinking about, oh, I've got all this content to cover, ask the question, what do I want students to do with the content that they're learning? And that to me is a big starting place. But then when you think like a coach with the game in mind or with the performance that you want ahead of you, you analyze the performance and think about the students or the players you have. So to play the game well, what knowledge will they need? What skills will be required? And that includes both basic skills and then skills that might involve teamwork. And thirdly, what understandings are needed to play the game well, otherwise known as game strategy. And so you task analyze the game based on its demands. Then you pre-assess your students, or if you know them well, you already know where their skill levels are, what knowledge base they might need, and what strategies you want to refine and improve. And so pre-assessment is really critical, knowing where you're going, knowing the demands of the performance, and then finding out where the players are or the students are, and then you start your teaching. If you think about it, coaching has different demands and different roles, as does teaching. There's a direct instruction and modeling role, particularly coaches of younger players. They've got to teach and directly model the skills, and the kids have to learn the rules. But over time, the coach really wants to step out of the picture. You want to work yourself out of a job. And so the coach goes from direct instruction to modeler to then letting the students perform. And the coach shifts then from a direct instructor more to a feedback giver. In fact, the term coaching is literally referring to giving feedback, right? And so if you think about the practices, it's going from direct instruction and modeling based on what the players need to increasingly letting the students do the work, and the coach becomes more of a feedback giver, because ultimately you're preparing students to play on their own. That to me is the model that works in coaching, and it can work in teaching as well. For many teachers of academic subjects, one of the big challenges they have is too much content and not enough time to teach it all well. Well, you could say the same thing about coaches, particularly coaches of beginners in a sport. There's a lot to learn. But what do? They keep the end in mind and work with the players they have just to get better and better. You never hear coaches say, "Oh, Lee, I don't have time for those games. They take all afternoon. How could I ever cover my playbook?" Right? But you hear teachers, with understandable reasons, feel, "Oh, I have so much content to cover. I just have to talk fast to try to get through it all." But the coach's mentality is, "I want to do the best job with the players I have, given the needs they have to help them play the game better. I don't have to cover every play in the playbook." They recognize it's a resource. The final point of coaching I'll make is, I know, related to your work and your model, which is differentiation. When I was a swim coach, I had different workouts for the sprinters versus the distance swimmers. And I had different practices for the beginners versus the champion elite level swimmers. Coaches differentiate naturally, either because players play different positions and there's different work they have to work on, or they have a range of abilities and skills on their teams. So similarly, teachers have a range of kids in their classroom, and differentiation is important, but always with the game in mind.
Wow, it's fantastic. So, for sure, your coaching background has, well, it's still here. It's evident when you're talking. It never left you.
It
So,
didn't.
yeah, it's fantastic. So, Understanding by Design by yourself and Grant Wiggins is one of the most well-known books for educators to learn about the best framework for designing courses and content units. So, can you tell us first what Understanding by Design, or UBD, is?
In essence, the title gives away its meaning. The two areas of focus are understanding, and I would proclaim, and have for many years, that the goal of a modern education is not just to teach kids lots of facts and hope they remember them, but to teach for understanding, ultimately so students can transfer their learning, so they can apply their learning to new things. But think about it, you can't transfer something that you don't understand. If all you have is rote learning, all you can do is give back what was told you in the way it was told. But transfer requires understanding. And so the first part of Understanding by Design is prioritize your curriculum, your teaching, your assessment toward preparing students for transfer and building the understanding base that they're going to need to transfer. Now, having said that, that is in no way to imply or suggest that we don't care about knowledge or basic skills will just take care of themselves. No, obviously there's foundational knowledge and basic skills in every discipline that have to be developed. But I like to propose that the basic skills should be considered the floor, not the ceiling of a modern education. And if the pandemic that we're still living through is a sobering reminder of anything, it's that the world is unpredictable. We're preparing students for a world that's increasingly complex, interconnected, and yes, unpredictable. And rote learning won't prepare you to navigate new opportunities and challenges. The ability to apply your learning flexibly and adaptively, it will. So part one of UBD is teach and assess for understanding and transfer, building on a base of the foundational skills. And then the second part of our title is by design. And we've simply described a planning process for planning curriculum, for thinking about assessments, and ultimately your teaching. That's a quote backward design process. And we've described this in terms of 3 stages of design. So in a nutshell, it's understanding by design.
Great. So, how did the idea start to write this book with you and your co-author?
Well, for people that don't know it, Grant Wiggins and I already had 20 plus years of experience in our profession, 40 plus years collectively, closer to 45. And we had 2 different career paths, but they came together fortuitously. I'll try to be brief here. Grant Wiggins himself went to a college in the United States called St. John's College. And the entire curriculum for St. John's College was built around Socratic seminars, reading great books. And the professors were called tutors, and they were around Harkness tables, and they used Socratic questioning. I remember when I first met Grant and learned about this, I said, well, I can understand how such an instructional approach would work in the humanities. But I said, well, what about, say, mathematics? Did you take math? He said, yeah, we had to take mathematics. I said, well, how did Socratic seminar work for a math course? He said, we read, for example, we read Euclid and debated the nature of theorem and proof. And I thought, wow, I had to memorize formulas and never understood them. Then when Grant went on to his teaching, which was in independent schools, he taught at the high school level, and he taught English, philosophy, debate, and even mathematics in some cases, and used these Socratic methods in his teaching. So he was very much steeped in essential questions, Socratic dialogue, and meaning making. He then went on from his teaching career to Harvard and got his doctorate with a focus on curriculum. He then worked with Ted Sizer at the Coalition of Essential Schools, which was a major reform project in the US. And so he was really promoting these progressive ideas, and also was instrumental in promoting greater use of, quote, authentic performance-based assessments. My career, and that's when we met kind of at that point, my career had been in gifted education, where things that we were doing literally in the 70s and 80s were what we would now today call project-based learning, authentic instruction, higher order thinking skills were prominent, 21st century skill type things. But after working in gifted programs for a number of years, I became increasingly convinced that the things that were happening for the very brightest type students should be much more widespread into the mainstream. And that was my commitment. And so he and I met, and our paths converged, fortuitously, it turns out, and Understanding by Design emerged from those two career paths and areas of interest.
Wow, fascinating backstory there. So I'm sure as you were writing, there were some challenges, or if any, I don't know, but I would imagine that there were. Could you tell us a little bit if what obstacles or challenges you had in the writing process?
It's an interesting question, which I don't think I've ever been asked. So I was reflecting on this. I don't think we had challenges as well. Maybe they were. The challenge was clarifying our ideas in ways that would be practicable and feasible for people to implement. And so that in some cases was a challenge. Grant Wiggins was one of the brightest people I've ever worked with, but sometimes his brilliance was way up here. And because of his background in kind of high achieving independent schools and an elite education himself, I think Grant sometimes was hard for him to imagine working in an inner city or having 45 kids in a class as opposed to 12 well-behaved, affluent kids around the table. So my role in our partnership was to try to translate his brilliance into practicable tools and techniques. But I would call that really a joy rather than a challenge. One of the things I respected most about Grant was, as smart as he was always intellectually humble, in the sense of he always would consider other points of view and be open to changing his position, but you had to convince him. So we had many spirited and lively debates on things. So again, I wouldn't call it a challenge as much as a joy to work with someone like that. And we both agreed that our work was better because we would, argue and debate, but always with the end in mind of clarity and usability.
Oh, fantastic. What a great partnership. So you also wrote the book Essential Questions, again with Grant Wiggins. What makes a question essential?
The way we define the term essential questions is through a set of characteristics or criteria. So here they are. To me, a good essential question should be open-ended. It's not a question that has a single fact answer. And in fact, one of the characteristics of essential questions is they are meant to be explored over time. It's not a question you ask once, get an answer, and then you're done with. Secondly, these should be intellectually engaging. They should be thought-provoking. The best essential questions make you go, I never thought of that. Or, I never thought the way you just answered it. So it expands thinking and it calls for thinking. A third and important essential question is that it should be tied to, quote, big ideas. I like to think of the essential question as like a doorway. By going through the door, by exploring the question, your goal is to develop and deepen student understanding of important ideas. So in other words, you could come up with a cool, thought-provoking question, but it needs to be going somewhere. You need to have intentionality in posing it. So I like to say the essential question is like the flip side of the coin, whereas the other side is a desired idea that you want students to really come to understand. So the question is a means to an end. Those are the key qualities: open-ended, thought-provoking, questions that can and should recur, and that are pointed toward important ideas or processes.
So I've also heard you say that essential questions serve as prioritizing filter in the classrooms. Can you explain that?
Sure, I'll try, I should say. As I mentioned, the essential question should be pointed somewhere. There should be a desired intention of engaging the students towards some end. And so you can do it a number of ways, but if you were to start with an essential question, and let me give one that cuts across disciplines as an example. Here's one of my favorite questions. How do I know what to believe in what I see, hear, or read? That to me is an essential question that gets at the heart of critical thinking. By posing that, you're actually after some understanding, such as not all information is equal, some information is untrue, some is biased, some is outdated, some is incomplete, some is narrow. And so to really understand something, you need to critically appraise. What is the claim? What's the source? Is this believable? Are there other perspectives I should consider? So by asking the question, how do I know what to believe in what I see, hear, or read? You're pointing toward understandings that really are the undergird, if you will, critical thinking, and that the disposition to be a skeptic and not to be gullible. So that's an example of purpose. Now, in terms of your question more pointedly, having clarity about the goals you're after, the big ideas and the processes you want is itself the prioritizing filter. But when you have one or more questions that point toward that, again, those become a means for prioritizing. You're not trying to cover every bit of content that you might, nor are you trying to explore every single question that could come up, because some of them are trivial or not really necessarily worth the time. An essential question means it's pointed toward essential knowledge, essential understanding that's really worth it. You want the juice to be worth the squeeze, in other words.
Nicely said. So here at the International Middle Years Curriculum, or IMYC, we have something called the process to facilitate learning. And after the entry point, the knowledge harvest takes place in the early stages of each unit and provides an opportunity for students to reveal what they already know about what they are studying. So the teacher can then analyze this information and use it to guide planning and differentiation. The bank of knowledge can then be added to or developed and even challenged by the teacher throughout the course of the unit. So, with your experience in research, what are some key components or strategies to make a knowledge harvest beneficial for differentiation?
That's a great question, and I'll answer it in sort of two modes. The first mode is more around purpose. And here's something we know, which is, of course, the basis for your framework. We know that the most significant factor that impacts new learning by students or by people in general is prior knowledge. Because of that understanding about learning, it's imperative that instructors and teachers and professors try to find out what students know or think they know before they start launching in and adding on new information or presenting new material. So, in the US or in my world, I've called that pre-assessment. Before you start something new, you're going to try to find out what the students know or think they know. So that's kind of the underlying rationale. There's a subset to this, which you of course know, and that is that in some content that we teach, students may have what some people would call a naive conception or a misconception. And this is especially notable in the sciences. And so what you're referred to as the knowledge harvest, and what I would call the need and importance of pre-assessment, would be to very deliberately and proactively try to find out early on not only what students know or think they know, but to target potential misconceptions. And so just quickly, using my previous example of critical thinking, we might present students with some examples of things that are found online and say, what do you think about this? Do you believe it? Would you believe it? Would you ask questions about it? How would you go about deciding if it was true? Just to see what capacity, if any, they have for beginning to critically appraise information that they find. In science, by the way, there's a wonderful author named Paige Keeley, Keely, who's developed a set of what she calls science probes that are targeted very specifically to research-based misconceptions that students often have in all the domains of science. And it's a great example of a resource for knowledge harvesting. Now, in terms of the particulars, the second part of my answer, which is how do you go about this? I've actually written a recent blog post on 8 formative assessment checks for understanding, many of which can be used as a knowledge harvest scheme. I'll give you a couple of these, and I will make a note to send you the article. So, I've always been up in a position of saying, let's be as efficient as possible in the classroom, but getting what we need. And so, a simple check for prior knowledge would be a true false, thumbs up, thumbs down signal by the student. You might give the kids 5 to 10 questions and say, this isn't going to be graded. I'm not going to evaluate you. I just want to see what you think. And you might give them a statement. So how many of you think that this statement that I found online is true? How many of you think it's false? How many of you aren't sure? And you could do that for almost any content that you want to teach to see what kids know or think they know. You can also build in misconception checks into that technique. So I have a marble and I have a bowling ball, and we're going to drop it from this tall tower. Do you think the marble will hit first, the bowling ball will hit first, or they'll hit equally? That's a quick check. And if kids put their thumbs up, thumbs down, use a whiteboard response, or use a cell phone response, you can get a quick check of the class. If the majority of kids think the bowling ball is going to hit first, now you know what you're going to teach around gravity and et cetera. Another example of a harvesting strategy would be, particularly for topics where you're trying to see if kids can or have made connections, have them do a concept map. If we're studying a topic in history or in science, for instance, you might say, what for you is the big idea and what are some of the subordinate pieces that go with it? And just make a visual map. And I might walk around as a teacher and say, Okay, Lee, I see the map you drew. Kind of talk me through. What are you seeing? That's a great check to see if kids have seen and made proper connections among things. It might take a little more time, but it's very revealing. And I have 6 other techniques that I've written about in the article that are quick but revealing, that could be used in a knowledge harvest.
Fantastic. We look forward to looking through those because I'm sure our listeners and our viewers would love to know more about that. So that would be great. We will definitely post your blog. Well, leading on to that, about understanding, checking that pre-assessment, that knowledge harvest, and seeing what students know and don't know is about myths. And what is one myth that you would like to debunk in education regarding differentiation?
Uh, Probably the most prominent concern that teachers have is that differentiation equals individualization or personalization. And I teach 32 kids in primary grades, or I have 160 kids in a secondary or a high school setting. How could I possibly do this? And in my experience, differentiation does not mean you're going to have to individualize for every kid. That's not feasible, and therefore it's not going to last. But what it does suggest to me to break the myth is no, you don't have to individualize for everybody, but you should be mindful of the fact that students are in different places, and you want to look to cluster or group in ways that are going to serve more kids. In the same way that coaches, I had a workout section in my at the pool for the sprinters, and over here the middle distance, and these folks were working on starts and turns. I didn't, even though I had 60 swimmers potentially in a practice, I wasn't doing 60 different practices. I had chunks, stations, if you will, working groups based on what they needed. So that would be the primary myth I want to bust.
Very good.
Oh,
Well,
actually, may I add to that one more piece? One of my general maxims in general, and I think it applies to differentiation, is 3 parts. Think big, start small, and go for early wins. Anytime you want to change or adopt a new strategy or try something that you've never done before, I encourage people to think big, and that means understand it, understand what differentiation is or isn't, and think big. Ideally, and might be 2-3 years from now, what would you like to see on a regular basis in your teaching? Start small. Don't bite off too much. Every teacher I know is already overwhelmed. So don't burn yourself out by being too ambitious. Start small and maybe just try one differentiation technique or one more than you tried before. Go for an early win. Pick a technique, a strategy, a group of students, a class that you think is going to be more likely to work well. Don't pick the toughest or the most demanding technique or the class you know is going to throw you off, because it's easier to build on an early win than to recover from a misstep where you try to do too much too fast with the wrong groups. So that's just served me well. Think big, start small, go for early wins, and then build on the early wins systematically to the point where you then have realized your think big vision.
that's great advice. Um, on a little side note here, because I have read that you set a learning goal at 57 to learn how to surf, and at 60, you completed that goal. Why surfing, and what have you learned as being as a surfer now?
Well, the why is based on the fact that I was a college swimmer. I was a coach, as I told you. I love the ocean, and I would go to the ocean whenever I could, and I would love to get on boogie boards and get into big waves and ride across the waves. But about 15 years ago now, my wife and I and another couple bought a condominium in Costa Rica on a surfing beach. And prior to that, I would only maybe get to the ocean once or twice a year. But now there's a place, and they have consistently good waves, and they have surf schools everywhere. So I thought, even though I'm an old guy, this is something I want to try. So it was my love of the ocean and the opportunity that was the answer to the why. But the second part of your question has been really interesting to reflect on. So what did I learn from it? Well, first of all, I'm in pretty good shape, even now at 71. And back then I was in good shape. I'm a strong swimmer. And so I thought, well, I can do this. So I signed up for a lesson, and there were 4 people in the lesson, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a teenager, and me at 57. And so we go out, and the instructor does the modeling on the shore and kind of explains the process. And I'd read about it a little bit, so I'm ahead of these guys. Then we get in the water, and I know how to catch a wave, and I'm a strong swimmer. But as a past middle-aged guy, trying to pop up fast on the board was really, really hard. And if you know anything about surfing, you only have a split second between when you catch the wave and you get up, because you have to control the board. And if you take too long, you fall off, or the wave flips you. So that was eminently frustrating. And I literally remember in that first lesson thinking, well, this is stupid. I'm the oldest guy out here. The kids were popping up and I'm falling off and people are watching me, and I'm thinking, why did I ever, I'm done with this. After the lesson, I was literally walking back off the beach, and I was thinking, well, shame on me. Because think about how many times, even in a day, a student may feel that way. Because we're asking them to learn new things in multiple subjects. And sometimes they don't get it right away. And sometimes other kids are getting it faster. And that negative self-talk is damaging. And so on the way back, I said, shame on me. I'm supposed to be an expert in learning. And here I am, not even willing to go through the inevitable frustrations that learning something new entails. So that was my sobering moment. Let me wrap up the answer. So here's what I learned, and here's my thought about it. Starting with my thought. I think it is beneficial, in fact, encouraged for people in our profession to try to learn something new, at least periodically, something out of our comfort zone. Because think about it, as adults, we tend to gravitate to our comfort zone and not try new things. And yet we get upset with kids when they don't try or they're not motivated. And that's point number one. Doing so brings about, I think, an empathy that is important to teaching. We need to empathize with the learner who is struggling, who is embarrassed if they're not getting it right away, or isn't interested. And trying to learn something new brings a humility and I think a degree of empathy for a beginning learner. But the other part of it that made it somewhat successful, and that I was able to get up and surf moderately in small waves, was what we know about learning. You need to understand what you're being asked to learn. So I actually went back and read a few things and watched a few videos to get a better sense, not only of how to catch the wave, but the pop-up. Secondly, I started doing exercises because I know these are movements I'd never done. And that helped a lot. And thirdly, I was much more attentive to watching good surfers and picking up just by observing. And then finally, I just practiced. I said, damn it, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to try to get up on one wave before I go in. And that's what we know, it's tied to growth mindset, right? So the bottom line, let's walk our talk. Let's apply what we know about learning, and let's put ourselves out there as learners to build the empathy for the novice that some teachers, quite frankly, might have forgotten as they age.
Again, that's very great advice, and I think that's very true. We get stuck in our comfort zones, as you say, and so it's difficult to try something new. And I think we should continue because that helps us to grow, and it also tests your theory and what you've been learning and working on for so many years too, which is fantastic.
Exactly.
So takeaways, Jay, we love takeaways, and you've given many already, but if there's one final takeaway you would like the listeners and viewers to know about with your research and discoveries in the field of education, what would it be?
everything starts with goals. Be clear about your goals and the priority. Ideally, this should be done collectively with a school district, with a school faculty, with a team. And then keep the end in mind and plan backward with that end in mind.
Fantastic. Jay, thank you so much for your time today, your insights, your stories. You have had such a great career, and it's so amazing that you're still creating and discovering, and you are publishing amazing material. And I like to say that for anyone who would like to know more information on Jay McTighe's latest work, you can check out his official website at jaymctighe.com. And again, I'd like to say thank you so much for sharing, and it was such a pleasure to interview you today.
Same for me, Lee. Thanks for the opportunity.